Have you ever noticed that some people simply vanish? Not physically, not dramatically, but quietly, gradually, almost invisibly. One day they are present in every conversation, active on every platform, visible in every social circle, and then, slowly, they begin to withdraw. They stop reacting to news. They stop performing for approval. They stop explaining themselves to people who were never genuinely listening. They do not announce their departure. They do not write farewell posts or deliver speeches about awakening. They simply become quieter, more deliberate, more absent from the noise. And the system, which depends entirely on your participation, your attention, your outrage, your clicks, your fear, notices their absence immediately, because the system cannot survive without you inside it. Yuval Noah Harari, one of the most widely read thinkers of the 21st century, has spent years mapping the architecture of the modern world with a clarity that most institutions prefer we do not possess. His central warning is not about a single technology or a single government. It is about something far more pervasive and far more difficult to name. It is about the growing power of systems, economic, political, technological, and algorithmic, to shape human beings from the inside out. Not through force, not through obvious coercion, but through the subtle, relentless colonization of attention, desire, and identity. And his most unsettling observation is this: the people who begin to see this clearly, the people who wake up to the mechanics of how the system operates, do not tend to become revolutionaries. They tend to disappear. For most of human history, power operated visibly. You could see the king. You could identify the army. You could point to the institution that controlled your life and name it. This visibility made resistance possible because you could locate the thing you were resisting. Revolutions throughout history shared a common feature. There was a visible enemy, an identifiable structure, a palace to storm, a law to overturn, a ruler to remove. The mechanics of power were external, legible, and in many cases, fragile. Remove the king, and the kingdom changed. Dissolve the institution, and its influence dissolved with it. What Harari identifies in the modern world is something categorically different. The systems that govern human life today do not primarily operate through visible force. They operate through invisible architecture. The algorithm that determines what you see when you open your phone is not a king. It has no face, no name, no address. It cannot be stormed or overthrown. It can barely be explained, even by the engineers who built it, because it learns and evolves faster than human understanding can track. Yet it shapes your perception of reality, your emotional state, your political opinions, your consumer behavior, your sense of what is normal and what is possible, more profoundly than any king in history ever shaped the perception of his subjects. And it does this not by commanding you, but by giving you exactly what your neurological vulnerabilities are most likely to respond to. It does not rule you. It reflects you back to yourself, endlessly, in forms carefully calibrated to keep you engaged, reactive, and unable to look away. This is the system Harari warns about. Not any single corporation, government, or ideology, but the interlocking web of incentives, platforms, biological vulnerabilities, and feedback loops that constitutes the informational and economic environment in which most people spend their waking lives. And the first thing you notice, when you begin to see this system clearly, is not outrage. It is something quieter and more disorienting. It is the recognition that almost everything you were taught to want, to fear, and to believe was shaped by forces with no particular interest in your flourishing, but a very precise interest in your continued engagement. The people who reach this recognition do not all respond in the same way. Some become angry, and their anger itself gets captured and monetized by the system, redirected into content, into tribal conflict, into the very outrage cycles that keep attention fragmented and platforms profitable. Some become evangelical, desperate to wake everyone around them, and discover that the urgency of their message pushes away the people they most want to reach. But some, perhaps the most perceptive, go quiet. They withdraw, not dramatically, but gradually. They reduce their surface area within the system. They stop performing. They stop reacting on cue. They stop giving the machine what it needs to continue modeling and manipulating them. And in doing so, They effectively disappear from the system's field of vision, even while remaining fully present in their own lives. Harari's warning is not that this disappearance is wrong. It is that it is misunderstood, both by those who disappear and by those who watch them go. The system interprets withdrawal as irrelevance. Colleagues interpret it as disengagement. Friends interpret it as depression or antisocial behavior. The cultural narrative around visibility, around the equation of presence with value, makes quiet withdrawal look like failure. In a world that measures worth through metrics, likes, followers, engagement rates, and public productivity, the person who steps back appears to have simply given up. But what Harari suggests, and what the evidence of history supports, is that what looks like disappearance from the outside is often, from the inside, the beginning of the most consequential kind of clarity. Consider what happens neurologically when a person genuinely reduces their exposure to algorithmically curated information. The initial experience is almost always uncomfortable. The brain, conditioned to expect constant stimulation, produces something resembling withdrawal symptoms: restlessness, boredom, the persistent sensation that something important is being missed. This is not metaphorical. The dopamine systems shaped by years of engagement with platforms designed to exploit them do not simply reset overnight. The discomfort is real, biological, and often intense enough that most attempts at withdrawal fail within days. This is not weakness. It is the predictable response of a nervous system that has been systematically trained to need what the system provides. But for those who endure this discomfort long enough, something begins to shift. The quality of attention changes. Thoughts that were previously fragmented by constant interruption begin to cohere. Ideas that were previously crowded out by the volume of external stimulation begin to surface. The ability to sit with a single thought, to follow a single line of reasoning without distraction, to tolerate uncertainty without reaching immediately for an answer or an opinion, begins to return. This is what Harari means when he speaks of the importance of knowing yourself. Not in the superficial sense of personality tests and self-help frameworks, but in the deeper sense of understanding your own emotional reactions, your own cognitive biases, your own capacity to be manipulated, well enough to begin counteracting these tendencies deliberately. The silent disappearance of people who wake up is, in this sense, less a departure than a return. A return to the kind of interiority that makes genuine thought possible. A return to the slower rhythms of attention that allow complex ideas to be genuinely processed rather than merely scrolled past. A return to a relationship with information grounded in curiosity and discernment rather than anxiety and reaction. These people do not disappear from life. They disappear from a particular version of life, the one lived primarily on the surface of the system, responsive to its rhythms, reactive to its stimuli, shaped by its categories. And in disappearing from that version, they become, paradoxically, more fully themselves. But there is a cost. Harari is clear about this, and it would be dishonest to minimize it. The social cost of stepping outside the system's dominant rhythms is real and significant. Human beings evolved as intensely social animals. The need for belonging, for recognition, for inclusion in the group is not a superficial preference. It is a deep biological imperative that shaped human psychology across hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. And the modern system, with extraordinary sophistication, has learned to weaponize this imperative. It has made belonging contingent on participation. It has made recognition contingent on visibility. It has made social inclusion contingent on conformity to the speed, tone, and content preferences of platforms whose business models depend on your continuous engagement. When a person withdraws from these systems, they do not simply withdraw from noise. They withdraw from the social infrastructure that has been built around it. They risk losing not just followers or engagement metrics, but genuine relationships, professional networks, and the sense of cultural participation that gives many people a significant portion of their daily meaning. This is not a trivial sacrifice, and the people who make it rarely do so easily. They do so because the alternative, remaining fully inside a system they can now see operating on them, has become more psychologically costly than the loneliness of stepping outside it. Harari's broader warning, the one that gives this withdrawal its historical significance, is that the systems being built in the 21st century are qualitatively more powerful than any that preceded them. Previous systems of power, whatever their capacity for coercion, could not reach inside the individual mind with the precision that modern technology now permits. They could control behavior. They could restrict information. They could punish dissent. But they could not monitor every heartbeat, predict every emotional state, model every preference, and deliver personalized stimuli calibrated to each individual's specific neurological vulnerabilities in real time. The systems being built today can do all of this, and they are becoming better at it at a rate that no governance structure has yet found a meaningful way to constrain. This is why the internal dimension of freedom, the capacity to know your own mind clearly enough to distinguish your genuine desires from those that have been manufactured for you, matters more in this century than it has in any previous one. External freedom, freedom of movement, freedom of speech, freedom of association, these remain critically important, but they are increasingly insufficient on their own. A person can be entirely free in the external sense, living in a democracy with full civil liberties, and still be comprehensively unfree in the internal sense, unable to distinguish what they genuinely value from what the system has conditioned them to pursue, unable to access the quiet necessary for genuine reflection, unable to form opinions that were not first shaped by algorithmic curation. This internal unfreedom is invisible from the outside. It is indistinguishable from ordinary life. And it is, Harari argues, the defining form of unfreedom that the 21st century is producing at scale. The people who wake up from this, who begin to see the mechanics of their own conditioning clearly enough to start working against it, face a question that has no clean answer. How do you remain human, connected, purposeful, and engaged with the world, while refusing to give the system what it needs to keep you inside it? How do you maintain relationships in a culture built around platforms you are trying to limit? How do you build a professional life in an economy increasingly structured around the attention economy you are trying to withdraw from? How do you stay informed without becoming a product of the very information ecosystems whose influence you are trying to reduce? These are not rhetorical questions. They are practical dilemmas faced by every person who takes Harari's warning seriously enough to act on it. There are no perfect answers, but there are patterns visible in the lives of people who have navigated this tension most successfully. They tend to invest heavily in what might be called slow relationships, connections built through sustained, in-person engagement rather than digital performance. They tend to favor depth over breadth in their information consumption, reading long-form work carefully rather than scanning large volumes of content quickly. They tend to develop what might be called attentional discipline, treating their focus as a finite and precious resource rather than a default offering to whoever demands it most loudly. And they tend to cultivate a tolerance for social invisibility, for the discomfort of not being seen, not being validated, not being counted, that most people in the modern world find deeply threatening. In the decades ahead, as the systems Harari warns about become more sophisticated, more personalized, and more deeply integrated into everyday life, the ability to maintain this kind of inner sovereignty will become increasingly rare and increasingly consequential. The people who develop it will not necessarily be those with the most intelligence or the most resources. They will be those with the most clarity about what they are willing to surrender and what they are not. Those who are willing to accept the social cost of partial disappearance in exchange for the cognitive freedom that disappearance makes possible. And perhaps this is the deepest irony of the moment we inhabit. In a world that equates visibility with value, the most important work often happens in invisibility. The most significant clarity often develops in silence. The most genuine human life is often lived at a remove from the platforms that claim to connect us. The people who vanish from the system are not, in most cases, defeated by it. They are, in the most meaningful sense, the ones who refused to be owned by it. They disappeared not because they had nothing left to say, but because they finally understood, with the kind of certainty that comes only from genuine reflection, that not everything worth thinking needs to be performed. Not everything worth knowing needs to be shared. And not every system that demands your participation deserves it. Yuval Harari's warning is not a prediction of inevitable catastrophe. It is an invitation. an invitation to see clearly what is being built around us and inside us before the architecture becomes so familiar that it is no longer possible to imagine anything beyond it. The people who are disappearing from the system are not running from the future. They are, in their quiet way, refusing to let the future be decided entirely by forces indifferent to their humanity. And in doing so, they may be preserving something that no algorithm can replicate, no platform can monetize, and no system can finally contain. The irreducible human capacity to step back, to think slowly, to choose deliberately, and to remain, in the deepest sense, free. What makes this moment historically unusual is not simply that systems of manipulation exist. They have always existed in some form. Propaganda, religious coercion, social conformity pressures, these are as old as human civilization itself. What makes this moment different is the combination of scale, precision, and invisibility with which modern systems operate. Previous propaganda required human messengers. Previous social pressure required physical proximity. Previous systems of behavioral influence were constrained by geography, by language, by the limits of what any centralized institution could monitor and respond to. The systems being built today face none of these constraints. They operate globally, simultaneously, on billions of individuals at once, tailoring their influence to each person's specific psychological profile, adapting in real time to every signal of resistance, and doing all of this so seamlessly that the experience of being influenced is indistinguishable, for most people most of the time, from the experience of simply living. This invisibility is not accidental. It is engineered. The most effective systems of influence are those that do not feel like systems at all. They feel like reality itself. When an algorithm curates the information you receive about the world, and does so consistently, across months and years, you do not experience this curation as manipulation. You experience the resulting picture of the world as simply the way things are. When platform design exploits neurological vulnerabilities to keep you scrolling, you do not experience this exploitation as coercion. You experience it as desire, as curiosity, as the natural impulse to stay informed. The genius of modern systems of attention capture is precisely that they have made the mechanism of capture invisible, leaving only the subjective experience of freely choosing to engage. This is what Harari means when he speaks of the possibility of hacking human beings. The word sounds technical and cold, but the reality it describes is intimate and pervasive. To hack a human being, in this sense, is not to break into their computer. It is to understand their emotional architecture well enough to predict and shape their decisions before they are consciously aware of having made them. It is to know, based on vast amounts of behavioral data, which kinds of content will trigger fear and which will trigger excitement, which narratives will activate tribal loyalty, and which will produce reflective hesitation, which moments in a person's emotional cycle make them most susceptible to particular kinds of influence. When systems possess this knowledge, and the algorithmic infrastructure to act on it in real time, the boundary between persuasion and manipulation becomes functionally invisible. The people who sense this, who begin to feel the contours of the mechanism through which they are being shaped, face a deeply uncomfortable recognition. It is not simply that they are being influenced. Everyone is influenced by their environment. It is that the influence is systematic, intentional, and calibrated to serve interests entirely disconnected from their own well-being. The platform that keeps you scrolling at midnight does not benefit from your getting enough sleep. The algorithm that feeds you outrage does not benefit from your arriving at nuanced understanding. The system that models your insecurities does not benefit from your developing genuine confidence. The interests of the system and the interests of the individual are not merely different. In many cases, they are directly opposed. And the system, unlike the individual, never sleeps, never forgets, and never stops optimizing. And so when a person wakes up to this reality, genuinely, and not merely intellectually but viscerally, in the way that changes behavior rather than simply enriching conversation, the response is rarely heroic resistance. It is something quieter, a gradual stepping back, a reduction in surface area, a deliberate narrowing of exposure. Not because they have given up on the world, but because they have finally understood that the version of engagement the system demands is not engagement at all. It is consumption dressed as participation. It is reaction performing as thought. It is the feeling of being informed without the substance of genuine understanding. And once you have seen this clearly enough, once the mechanism has become visible enough that you can no longer pretend it is simply the natural texture of modern life, the only honest response is to begin building something different. Quieter, slower, more genuinely your own. This is the silent disappearance that Harari warns about, and that deserves our most serious attention. Not because it is dramatic, but because it is real, it is growing, and it may represent something important. Something that a civilization saturated with noise, addicted to speed, and organized around the relentless capture of human attention has made dangerously scarce. The simple, stubborn, irreplaceable act of thinking for yourself.